This is Robert Jackson's 126th birthday. Robert Jackson was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, and the first trial that occurred after the Nuremberg trial, headed by our Robert Jackson, was one led by Richard Goldstone, being the trial in Yugoslavia. And I think that's a place kind of near and dear for you. So if we could biographically, let's go back there.
Yeah, we can begin back there. So I was born in Kosovo, which is former Yugoslavia, one of the republics, one of the autonomous states in Yugoslavia. And during the 90s, Kosovo decided to declare independence, essentially bankruptcy. Following, of course, places like Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia. So after all of those countries decided to declare independence, some of the folks in Kosovo decided to do the same thing, particularly because Slobodan Milosevic, who came to power in the 1980s, decided that the Serbs would become the primary citizen holder, and everybody else was secondary. So all of these other countries decided that they wanted to be on their own. And then Milosevic decided that that's something that would not work in his benefit and in the benefit of the Serbian people, and therefore decided to basically kill a whole bunch of people. About 400,000 between Bosnia and Kosovo.
Where were you during all of that time period? Were you still there?
I was born in '83, so that's a few years after Slobodan came to power. I was there until 1990. Then we left to Sweden for a couple of years, came back, and then the war started in 1997. So from there, we were in the middle of the war for a couple of years, and then we ended up in a refugee camp in Macedonia, and then we got sponsored to come to the United States.
During that time period, did you lose relatives during that?
Well, of course, yeah. In all, so Kosovo's population is about 1.8 million. 1.2 million got displaced, and in that struggle, about 40,000 of them got killed. Relatives, not in the immediate family, but yeah, we've lost relatives along the way.
Have you followed the tribunal's activities there against Karadzic and Milosevic? Of course, Milosevic died during the middle of the trial.
Yeah, and the most recent one was a pleasant thing. What they did, they basically put him in jail for life, right?
Mladic and
Karadzic. I've been following from the far, obviously. I've been too busy getting the life started here and making sure that we have a stable upbringing here. So, but it's obviously a lot of people got away, in both sides. But at the end of the day, at least the big players got to face justice.
What's your life's journey then? You were in a displaced persons camp?
We were in a refugee camp in Macedonia.
Right.
And at that point, America had sponsored, I believe, 5,000 people. We were among the first to arrive to the United States in a military camp in Fort Dix, New Jersey. There we were recruited by cities like Erie, Pennsylvania. At that point, we had no idea Erie, Pennsylvania existed. In fact, when they asked us where we wanted to go, we had told them we wanted to be close to New York, meaning New York City. And the representative of the International Institute here in Erie said, well, we're only 20 minutes away. So that's how we got to Erie, Pennsylvania. And it's been fun.
So what year would that have been, Ferki?
That was in June of 1999.
So June of 1999, you're located in Erie, Pennsylvania, probably knowing no one.
Yeah, that's just about. We brought with us some of the Albanians that we knew from back home came as well. But essentially from here, we knew no one. The International Institute made some connections immediately. One of them was they introduced us to the college presidents, and they opened this world to us. I got sponsored by former president of Mercyhurst College, now Mercyhurst University, Dr. William Garvey, to go to Mercyhurst Prep for my high school instead of going through ESL and public schools. I went to Mercyhurst Prep for 4 years. From there, I went to Mercyhurst Northeast for a year because my SATs were not anything to go home and brag about. But I did pretty well at Mercyhurst Northeast, and then got transferred to Mercyhurst Maine in the Intel department there, and I graduated there in 2007.
And all along that time period, one of your mentors was Dr. Garvey.
Right. So once a year he would check up on me, make sure that I didn't fall off the face of the earth. But we got reconnected in 2007 as I was looking for work. There was a new discussion in town in Erie to start a think tank. I started doing some research for Dr. Garvey, and then in 2008, when this think tank opened, they brought me in as a research director.
What was the vision of the Jefferson Educational Society? What was Dr. Garvey's vision?
Well, so that whole thing started because they did a study in the early 2000s which showed Erie, when it came to discussions of new ideas, it showed Erie was about 10 to 12 years behind some of the more progressive cities in the country. So obviously there was a lack of discussions of new ideas in Erie. So they wanted to provide some kind of a platform. They weren't sure how it was going to look at the beginning, but they wanted to provide some kind of a platform where new ideas can be discussed.
So Dr. Garvey, I know you and Dr. Garvey actually came up and checked us out at the Jackson Center a few times, and we've always really appreciated the relationship.
I think what you're doing with Jackson Center is absolutely marvelous. And you were a fairly new organization at that point, so it was good for us to go and see somebody who's built something so great in a small community. And you serve sort of as a role model for the Jefferson on what can be achieved, even in the place in Erie, where big things usually are not sought after. So we wanted to see who does it best, and at that point, you were, and I think you still are. So we started small in Erie. We partner up with a Jewish synagogue called the Brit Shalom Congregation. It's interesting there because they were going through a decline in population, the Jewish community in Erie. They had gone from 500 families down to about 60. So they had all this space that they did not need, and they were actually looking to sell their building. And what we decided to do is partner up, tell them that they could stay there as long as they want, so they never have to sell their building, but we could use some of their facilities. And it's worked perfectly. So when we started, we started very small. We offered about 10 to 12 programs a term, draw about 10 to 15 people. But every new term we provided, we vastly underestimated the intellectual thirst of Erie, and we were growing at about 100% each term. We were doubling our numbers each term, and that continues today to about 40%. Each term we grow about 40% today.
Tell a little bit about this. I mean, it's an opportunity for this Chautauqua group who's at a high, they're all at a high intellectual capacity. I'm telling you, just the kind of people over.
I have no doubt.
And just tell them a little bit about what you're doing, because you do well over 100 programs a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we did the research, when actually they appointed me to do the research in finding the best models for think tanks around the country, we had found Brookings Institution, and what they were doing was really phenomenal in terms of their research in publishing books and essays and journals, and basically having a paper type of research-driven white papers. So we found that. Then we wanted the programmatic kind of institution as well, where we bring lectures from both from within and go in and outside Erie and find some of the best thinkers around the country. So we, of course, found Chautauqua, and we found the 92nd Street Y, and that's what we really try to project in Erie. Is we offer about 100 programs a year now. We're drawing 160 people per program, so it's pretty incredible for a city of Erie. We have talks just recently. Actually, last night we had a talk on neuroscience of learning, and how can neuroscience improve the way we teach in schools. I offered a lecture on Hannibal and Spartacus. We had another lecture a few days ago from a lady who came from Allegheny College talking about motherhood in the digital age. So our lectures can go anywhere. It's a wide variety of topics, similar to what you would find in a place like Chautauqua, of course, with a lot less variety of it.
What's the name of your organization?
It's called the Jefferson Educational Society.
And I would highly recommend it, and what I'll do is I'll send out on the grapevine your website, because you have amazing programs, and we're actually doing some together with you with the Jackson Center. Jonathan Haig, the guy we talked about, who did the author of Ali, will be doing a morning lecture at the Jackson Center, going to Jefferson that evening. But it's well worth looking at. You'd say Erie's just a shot away, so I highly recommend that you look at it and take advantage of it. So, you're now the president of the Jefferson Educational Society.
Sure. That's what they call me nowadays. I think that just means more responsibility.
And Concha's the first lady?
Sure. She's got the best job in town. But yeah, I mean, we offer four terms a year, obviously, winter, spring, summer, and fall. And then we offer a big conference, which goes about 3 weeks now in the fall, called the Global Summit. And there we really bring in some pretty fantastic speakers. People like Doris Kearns Goodwin and Koki Roberts and E.J. Dionne and David Brooks and Francis Fukuyama and so on and so forth. The Global Summit, the 10th year is coming up this November, and so far it's looking like it's going to be a heck of a conference.
Well, I applaud you ever so much, and through this process you have had this intellectual curiosity ever since day one that we met you, and one of them, that intellectual curiosity, led to you applying for and to the School of Education and University of Pittsburgh for your Doctor of Education, which then led to you considering a thesis, which then led to a document called The Rise and Decline of the Chautauqua Movement and Its Lessons for the 21st Century Civic Adult Education. Now, I told...
Long title.
Okay. We were supposed to have really...
I did not pick it, by the way.
But those are when you do a dissertation, I mean, they're like a paragraph long, one sentence. But as I told these folks that you were able to defend this with an academic group of high level, but I said, you've got to defend it here at Chautauqua because this is even a higher level. What caused you to pause and even take on this subject?
Well, along the way, I did get my master's at Gannon University in public administration. So, but our board at the Jefferson wanted more scholarly practice, particularly when understanding the adult learner. It's very different than when we're talking about pedagogy. So my aim was to go and find a program somewhere around the country that would help us enhance what we were doing at the Jefferson. So the program particularly is a sort of a hybrid between the School of Education and the School of Political Science at University of Pittsburgh, and it focuses on one particular thing, and that's how you use education to advance your community. So I did a 3-year coursework followed by a dissertation. In terms of defending in front of you folks, it's important to understand that it is not a descriptive study. There are wonderful authors out there, including one in the audience, Dr. Talbot, back there, who do a wonderful job in describing the phenomena of Chautauqua movement. It's supposed to be more of lessons of the Chautauqua movement for practitioners like myself. Is what was the secret sauce of the Chautauqua movement? You know, it's really phenomenal. It's a phenomenal story. How does something that starts in Western New York end up going national at its peak? There are well over 600 daughter Chautauquas around the country. So why were they so successful? That's when I decided to come over here and go through some of the archives, and I had a quick interview with the archivist here and Dr. Talbot, and I decided that that's where I wanted to go. Is why study anything else when you can study the one organization that did it best at its peak? Depending who you ask, 50 million Americans were taking Chautauqua programming. And essentially, what my dissertation discusses is that there were, at that point in the 1870s, there were really 3 countries being formed here. You had the South, which was coming out of the Civil War, was struggling. You had the Northeast, which was prospering at that point. And then you had the Midwest. And the most unique thing that I found early on is I decided, well, I'm going to start mapping these Chautauquas and see what the cartography will tell me. It turns out that Chautauquas were, when we think of Chautauquas here, we obviously think of our area, but 62% of all Chautauquas were in the Midwest. Another 22% were in the South. And then I went back to John Vincent himself and see what was the vision. The vision was there was a huge educational gap amongst Americans. There were the circulation of ideas were not happening in smaller communities because they lacked educational opportunities. Similar to what was happening in Erie in the 2000s, which is you have a community, You have great educational institutions, but they're focusing more on next year's class than providing civic engagement for the elderly adults, who just so happen to be the folks that vote and decide policy.
So as you started down this road, and before you started doing research with Mary Lee and John Schmitz and doing that, what did you think you were going to find? What was that? You had to always walk in with kind of an initial thought.
Well, one of the things that I initially thought I was going to find immediately is this grassroots effort of start small and grow big, and that was not the case. The first year Chautauqua here, depending again who you ask, but John Schmidt says that there were 20,000 people, and since he's the archivist, I believe him. There were 20,000 people that came to the first Chautauqua in 1874, right here, from all over the country. And it made sense because now you have 20,000 people. Let's assume that 10,000 of them were not from our area, and this whole movement got started there. That was the biggest surprise. Then we can get into the decline and why that happened. That was also surprising, because an organization that started as an organization that brings people together, mostly Protestant and different sects of Protestantism, it was designed to show Americans that what makes us Americans is more important than what divides us. And later on in the 1920s, and actually it starts right around 1910s, it started becoming an institution where the new Americans, as we were becoming a much more of a diverse country, particularly with the growth of the Catholic Church in America, the Chautauqua movement did not open their doors. So that was another shock.
As we started doing the research, there's the founders. You talked about that in your paper, the founders being Bishop Vincent and Lewis Miller. What did you learn about their relationship towards the idea of adult education?
Well, and again, there are books and books written about John Vincent and his philosophy, but the most important thing were they saw this division of educational attainment in this country. John Vincent himself did not have a formal education, so but he obviously somewhere along his life found some good education, particularly with the Methodist Church, and he decided to give that kind of opportunity. Attorney Miller, he was not an attorney. Why do I call him attorney?
I don't know.
He wanted to be an attorney. I don't blame him.
But he.
No, he was an entrepreneur and inventor. So
There you go. See, I should have had her read my dissertation before. But he financed it. He financed the vision, and then later on made the connections to the big business people around the country, who then, at least according to the New York Times, in a 1914 article, the Rockefellers of the world, the J.P. Morgans of the world, they got together and they decided whether a Chautauqua institution is needed and can be supported in particular communities. And again, based on the research I found, they targeted places with less than 30,000 people.
Vincent, of course, like Robert Jackson, just thought I'd throw that in, never went to college, and here he became a bishop. Jackson becomes a justice. It just so happens. Describe the Chautauqua movement in the following manner. People coming to Chautauqua are not expected to abandon their church relations. They come without compromising conviction. to join in a broad movement for the increase of power in every branch of an, at this time, Protestant church and throughout our American society. This was principally focused in on the Protestant, non-Catholic community, right?
Protestant, non anything else.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, really, the first Catholic home here or church here at Chautauqua was not established till well into the 1980s. It's 20-something odd years after John F. Kennedy became president. There was articles that I was reading in the 1930s. One particular person said that you would come to Chautauqua gathering, you would see 8,000 to 10,000 people, and about 50 or 100 of them were Catholics. So that was the intent initially, and I think later on it sort of gave up in some of the initial dreams that it had of bringing the country together.
Just for the camera, when you use the term Chautauqua movement, what's the definition of? We're here at Chautauqua Institution, the mothership, but what's Chautauqua movement?
It's an educational movement.
Okay.
It's a movement in which millions of people took part in it. It is not a unique phenomena that happens in a corner of the world. It is widespread.
And within that, when you hear terms, you hear things like the Chautauqua Circuit, which seemed to me was a term used for folks who are sort of trying to monetize the concept.
Whenever there's something that works well, usually people that want to are going to look and making money off of it. The Chautauqua circuits were organized and funded. Were organized by organizations that wanted to make money out of the movement. And that's when you get into, again, one of the reasons it fell is because people could not separate the two. Right? So you had nearly 3,000 circuits happening around the country in the this was 1916. There were 3,000 circuits that took place in America. And these are basically just companies coming in and around, getting a speaker or a program, contract with them to go to X amount of cities, and the money became the motive. So people were not picked based on what they had to say. They picked based on how many people would want to go see them. Mass appeal. The Chautauqua circuits were very male-driven organizations. In terms of, if you went to a daughter Chautauqua, you had pretty much a 50-50 split. Whereas if you went to a Chautauqua circuits, you were probably looking at 90% male in the audience, and the speakers close to 100%.
So just to get back to the Chautauqua circuit, I know in your book you refer to a particular promoter who would actually talk about the normal procedure is they put up a tent, and in comes a Williams Jennings Bryan that day, and then they go to another city, put another tent in, and Bryan would go to tent 2 while somebody would come into tent 1?
Yeah, the tents were usually stationary for the season there, and the speakers were going back and forth. And
when you talk about daughter Chautauquas, what's that mean?
Those are stationary institutions. Like you have the Chautauqua here, which is obviously Mother Chautauqua. You had about 500 to 600 of brick and mortar Chautauquas that established around the country. There are still about 17 of them today, Particularly, there's a big one in Boulder, Colorado. They've expanded their programming to become something which I don't know if their founders would recognize, but they're still there. Canada is investing in basically studying their connection to the Chautauqua movements, and based on some of my preliminary research that I've done there, there's about another 16 or 17 Chautauquas that are re-emerging in Canada. So there's still Chautauquas that organizations that they don't even know that they were part of the Chautauqua movements. They've changed their name along the way somewhere, but that's what we're talking about. Daughter Chautauquas. They were independent, which meant the variety of programming could really fluctuate.
Back to the mothership and Bishop Vincent. It was shortly after they had their first meeting in 1874 that the CLSC was created to sort of create some sort of, I suspect, continuity of teaching.
Yeah, the root of the Daughter Chautauquas start with the CLSC, which is these reading, well, now we call them the reading circles, but or book clubs, rather, we call them today. But they were far more than that. They guaranteed, so they were this assigned reading for what I could get, and Mary Lee, you could correct me if I'm wrong, because she's the specialist in this. But for what I understand, the books initially were picked by Bishop Vincent himself, and they were designed usually about 4 books a year.
It fluctuated.
Right, initially, yeah. About four books. I've seen years as high as 6 initially. And they were designed that if you participated in these book reading circles for 4 years, you could have the equivalent of a college degree. And they targeted people around the nation. So they established a workforce here out of Chautauqua in Western New York, and then they were sent out to basically create these reading circles, who then decided to bring speakers and talk about what they were reading, and some of the daughter Chautauquas began as a result of the CLSC.
Bishop Vincent, in his book that you quote, called The Chautauqua Movement, published in 1886, stated that the ideal person to benefit from the concept of Chautauqua was a farmer's wife in rural America.
That's correct. It's true. I mean, even to today, the best way to educate a child is by educating the parent. So there could seem some idealistic way, but he believed that the way you educate the boy is by educating the mother. So that's who the targeted person was for the CLSC.
How was this funded? I mean, this is, when you think about a school, books, research, writers, are they selling the books? How are they subscribing to this stuff?
Yeah, the books were, you had to purchase the books, and to purchase the way in becoming part of the CLSC. How Chautauquas were funded, philanthropy, really different models. The one in Boulder, Colorado was government. You had the railroads that sponsored many Chautauquas because they wanted people to travel to certain destinations, and they sold land to create Chautauqua, daughter Chautauquas. But philanthropy, so when the economy was good, the Chautauquas did well in general. But when we went into the recession, many of them didn't make it. In fact, I think only maybe 7%, maybe 10% made it out of the Great Depression.
You mentioned in your article that contributing factors to the growth of Chautauqua movement, you mentioned the railroads, the ability to get someplace. The Chautauqua circuits, which we talked about, and we talked also how the for-profit of guys like Keith Vaughter. Yep. He must have been quite a guy. And just family.
He actually was.
Yeah.
It's the people that followed him. He started the Circuit Chautauquas. So by all accounts, I don't find him to be a bad owner of Circuit Chautauquas. It's the other 20 organizations, 20 companies that decided to start their circuits is when you had a vacuum of talent, which was a big part of what was happening there.
So we have this rise, this meteoric rise of the Chautauqua movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it then turns around and it goes south. Well, can you attribute that?
Well, depending on who you ask, I do think that obviously for somebody who believes in quality of education and looks at this type of education as sort of like a restaurant, once you go and have a bad meal, you're never going to go back again. So I think quality control was the number one thing that took this movement down. It's particularly they lost quality among the circuits. And then that followed in the daughter Chautauquas. It's just they did not have enough good speakers to go around and good programming to go around. So that's my theory. That's the primary reason. There's obviously other reasons. John Schmidt says that their open door policy was no longer available to new Americans. He pretty much says that that's the number one reason. Radio and movies at that point start growing. The economy, the Great Depression was also a big reason. But for me, quality control is the number one thing that you can look at and just say, wow, you had too many people doing their own thing.
The name Chautauqua, though it's in the dictionary, was never trademarked, was never branded, was never that. Do you think that's part of the quality control where all of a sudden Chautauqua?
You win some, you lose some, right? So if they did not have an open sort of thing going on, wouldn't have grown if they tried to control it. My theory is probably not. I think later on, as I mentioned in my later part of my dissertation, is they could have gotten some kind of certificate program going. That if you were qualified or if you were certified by a centralized Chautauqua as your programming being deserving, then you could have you could have saved the movement. At least that's what I would have done if I was part of it. Eventually, at the beginning, it needed that freedom, and towards the end, when things got out of control, it would have been helpful for some kind of certificate program to come along.
So many of the daughter Chautauquas during that 20s, 30s, as they're running into financial issues on the other side, they still have a brand name. And what happened to them? Did they absorb themselves into this?
Many of them just flat out closed their doors. A lot of them merged within higher education or within other organizations. But it's very, very expensive to run this kind of high quality educational institution. So yeah, many of them just closed their doors, probably about half of them closed their doors after 1 or 2 seasons.
I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit because it's sort of a relevant question today. Chautauqua institution, this is on the diversity problem. Nothing worse than a guy who reads from something you probably haven't read in a long time.
Yeah, that's one of the things that happens with dissertations. You get so sick and tired of the subject that you want to take about a year break. That was my advisor saying, just take a year break and then come back to it and we can talk about publishing opportunities and stuff like that.
And here you are within 6 months
Right.
dealing with it. Yeah, I'm sorry.
With a bad back.
Yeah, with a bad. And you're doing great, and we won't keep you much longer. Diversity problem. Chautauqua Institution archivist, and you've already referred to this, and historian John Schmitz suggested that the main reason for the decline of Chautauqua movement is the fact that it failed to welcome the new non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Protestant Americans. People at Chautauqua saw immigration and racial diversity as a problem rather than a solution to growth. And further, it was no secret that even Bishop Vincent brought in speakers to sort of underscore that. Do you want to comment a little bit on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there were. So the information that I get is from from the Chautauqua newspaper. So don't shoot the messenger. But they would have speakers. I think I quote one of them as being
Colonel John Bain.
Right.
George Bain.
George Bain, who would come in and talk about the African American and the Catholic problem. Right. That would be an actual lecture title. And the description of what he said in those lectures were even less open to the ideas. And how John Vincent is attributed to this guy is that he came to Chautauqua multiple times and was introduced each time by John Vincent. So, I mean, we're judging somebody who's not here to defend himself. So, but it just so happened to be that, inclusive America was a good idea, but bringing the people loyal to the Pope was a little too much.
You also went on to talk about too much entertainment and not enough education, where Chautauqua sort of moved its compass, if you will, from the educational component to even maybe more diversity.
This is the movement. Again, I think the Chautauqua here kept it in check pretty well. But the movement itself, I mean, specifically with the Chautauqua circuits, I mean, they brought in concerts and they brought in entertainers and at times things like, humor, and it just became like any other entertainment organization in the country at that point. So what made Chautauqua Chautauqua movement unique was based on the 8 propositions of what made a good education that John Vincent drew himself. One of the things is you have education with some entertainment, not entertainment with some education. Right, so they really didn't follow some of those things going forward.
So you've done this study, and at some point you got to draw closure to your dissertation. And what are the lessons learned from the Chautauqua movement experience that you kind of articulate today? You said in your lead into your lessons and recommendations, Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "We are not makers of history, we are made by history." How does that tie into your sort of conclusion?
Well, I mean, did Chautauqua movement, this is a question that I had to answer in my head, did it go away? Well, not particularly. Because there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations that were popping up all over the country trying to fill the void that was left behind by the movement, including, 100 years later, the Jefferson Educational Society. We are a 21st century Chautauqua institution. So that's what I meant by that point. It's the history that we've had is why we're here in the first place. The lessons, obviously, is being an open and an accessible organization. That's something that has already been introduced in the strategic plan of the Jefferson Educational Society. As a result, we have put into our bylaws that 40% of our programming will be free and open to the public indefinitely. Quality control has already been instituted into our strategic planning. What else did I say there?
Oh, you said the civic should be open to everyone.
But
Quality control, the certification program, centralized headquarters, programming must be affordable, civic adult education must be open to everyone, and new ideas should be explored.
Right. So one of the things that I think even the president, Michael Hill here, is talking about is the one void that has not been filled is targeting these mid-sized to small cities America. Places like Erie and places like Corey and Oil City and Meadville and small city America does not have the adult educational opportunities that you would find in big cities. The big cities came together. You don't need a Chautauqua institution in Pittsburgh. University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon and all those big universities, they have their own programming. But who is providing them in places like rural America? Like you're talking about the innovation district, right? That we brought into Erie, Pennsylvania. These things have been happening around the country for 15, 20 years, right? Things like innovation district, things like strategic planning, things like what new tools can you use to become a better mother in the 21st century. Those ideas are not traveling in rural America. Hence why we have this human development disconnect between rural America and city America. You have, again, two Americas being developed. We found this out in 2016, right? The cities are prospering, and then we have everybody else that's spread out throughout the country. That's why I get into heated arguments with people who are anti-electoral college. Because without it, you have majority rule. And you have what's going on in Russia, where you have one city or two cities in Russia. In Russia, you have Moscow and St. Petersburg prospering, and everybody else is left out. Because the majority of the population is now around the coastal areas. That's why the founding fathers, that's why James Madison wanted this electoral college, so that we don't disconnect. But we are being disconnected, particularly because of adult ed. At least that's my theory.
As part of what you've just said, now that you're the president, you have more say than probably you had before. What do you see the Jefferson Education Society looking like 5 years from now?
Well, we need to become an organization that is accessible, as I said. And how we're going to do that is we're already launching a Jefferson satellites. We're going to be opening Jeffersons in downtown Erie. We're going to open a Jefferson in northeast Pennsylvania. We're going to open a Jefferson in Fairview, Pennsylvania. and then one in Erie, Pennsylvania. So we're going to start with the county, right? We are an Erie County organization. So we're already thinking about how do we go and become more accessible to places where they need it. One of the most poorest communities in the entire nation is a place called Union City, Pennsylvania. What are we doing for them? So taking that kind of model is we're going to grow strategically in places where the Jefferson is needed the most. We like being on Upper State Street, but we need to expand. The other thing is it's good to have speakers come in and talk about a particular program like economic development. So, but it's different when you have somebody who's working on this 24/7 or year-round. So we're going to launch a scholar in residence program, and there are far too many people who retire too young, Greg, yourself included.
Not yet.
But there are all these wonderful minds that retire at 60, 65, and they have nothing to do. So we're going to establish about 8 to 12 positions in things like culture and history and economic development and new ideas and science and whatever. And we're going to hire these folks to come in. They will have an office to go to. They're going to be designed to target people who retire. So they have somewhere to go to, an office, and then they will be assigned to write 1 or 2 essays a year and then go around the community and basically provide the education in the field that they're in. So that's another thing that we're going to institute. So I'm just going to be surrounded by some very, very experienced people, and a 34-year-old is going to try to tell them what to do.
Well, I really appreciate you coming up here, Ferki, not only sharing the gospel of the Jefferson Educational Society, sharing your research, especially tonight, because you've had to go through a lot to get here tonight. I thank Katja for driving
Absolutely.
you up. And she told me, don't wear him out because I still have to get him back.
Yeah, I got to get better, but this is important. Greg and I are starting a new form of partnerships because we recognize that quality programming is important. So we're trying to figure out ways to help each other bring in some of the best talent and speakers around the country. So what does sharing cost look like? Because if you're not dealing with the administration of this thing, you'll be surprised how expensive it is to bring somebody from Washington, D.C. and New York. So how do we help each other with those kind of things? We've had a meeting with Chautauqua here. How do we work together? That's still in the process rather. This is important. It is important that we have a well-informed citizenry. It is important to recognize, and you can get into the learning theory of adults in my dissertation, to recognize that people don't continue their education voluntarily. Some do, most don't. It's important to recognize the power of applause, that we are not solitary beings, rather we are social beings, and the way we learn best is by learning together. That's why you're all here tonight, and that's why we need a Chautauqua of the 21st century.
I have one last question before we call it a night. We have in the cheap seats here Jim and Maureen Raveno. What do the Ravenos mean to Ferki Ferati?
Their lovely daughter was my guidance counselor at Mercyhurst Prep. She was one of the difference makers It's you all need. We all need people along the way, and she was one of those wonderful people that helped me when I didn't really speak the language. And you know, I attribute Mercyhurst Prep the fact of all of my success, because that's where it began, and they saw something that obviously I did not at that point.
So now we're going to exercise our power of applause, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Did I take it all right?
I'm not asking you to stand up. You don't have to acknowledge it.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.